During the Second World War, Britain's Royal Air Force flew thousands of sorties over Europe as part of the wider Allied strategic bombing campaign. Since these missions were flown from the very start of the war in September 1939, all the way up to the end of the war in May 1945, they were flown by a whole host of different Bomber Command aircraft, but two of these stand out, the Avro Lancaster and the Handley-Page Halifax. These two aircraft, looking remarkably similar, were both modern, four-engined heavy bombers, produced in similar numbers, using the same engines, and nearly identical defensive armament. But I'm sure if I were to ask you which of these two you'd be more familiar with, it would be the Lancaster. In fact, I'd wager that very few of you know much about the Halifax at all. And there's a reason for that. The Lancaster was simply the superior aircraft in speed, range, bomb load, and service ceiling. In fact, for each Halifax lost over Europe, 48 tons of bombs were dropped. For each Lancaster lost, 107 tons were dropped, almost twice as effective. In December 1943, the Lanc was over 4 times more effective than the Halifax, and in January 1944, it was over 5 times more effective. So that raises a few questions. Namely, what went wrong with the Halifax? Why were they still in production and flying missions in 1945? And, considering such a vast performance difference, how is it possible that they both came from the same requirement? A requirement, may I add, for a twin-engined medium bomber. This is the story of the Handley-Page Halifax, Britain's other heavy bomber. Where it came from, how it compared with the Lancaster throughout the war, and why it made Arthur Harris threaten to kill someone. First, we need to understand the 1936 Air Ministry requirement that somehow led to both of these bombers. Specification P.13.36. This specification asked for a twin-engined mid-wing medium bomber suitable for worldwide use that would eventually replace aircraft like the Whitley, Wellington, Hampton and Warwick that were just entering service themselves. Despite keen competition from many aircraft manufacturers, this was soon narrowed to two designs, the Avro 679 and the Handley-Page HP 56, both of which were to use a pair of massive Rolls-Royce Vulture engines. Both aircraft were ordered off the drawing board in 1937, with the Avro 679 the clear favourite. But even by summer 1937, the Vulture power plants were suffering from serious reliability problems, so as a contingency, the Air Ministry asked Handley-Page to redesign their HP 56 to use 4 slightly less powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engines instead. This new bomber emerged as the HP 57 and was promising enough that 100 units were ordered in January 1938 before work on the two prototypes had even begun. This aircraft was powered by 4 1280 horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin 10 engines and would enter service in November 1940 as the Handley-Page Halifax. In the same month, the Avro design would also enter service as the Avro Manchester, still powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Vultures. So, let's quickly compare the first of these Avro and Handley-Page designs. The Manchester Mark I was a 14-ton aircraft with a 90-foot wingspan, powered by 2 1760 horsepower Rolls-Royce Vultures, allowing it a top speed of 265 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 19,200 feet, a maximum bomb load of 4.7 tons, with a maximum range of 1,200 miles carrying this bomb load. Meanwhile, the Halifax Mark I was a 15-ton aircraft with a 99-foot wingspan, powered by 4 1280 horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin 10s, allowing it a top speed of 265 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 18,000 feet, a maximum bomb load of 5.9 tons, with a maximum range of 1,700 miles carrying that bomb load. These aircraft, despite having slightly different strengths and weaknesses, are certainly pretty evenly matched, which isn't too surprising given their joint origin. The Halifax certainly had some issues, which we'll get into later, but the Manchester was a death trap. The Vulture engines simply did not work and were incredibly prone to failure. As one pilot put it, the engines never were and never did become reliable. You felt that if you lost one, that was it. You weren't coming home. It didn't matter if you feathered the propeller or not. There was only one way you went, and that was down. I have seen an aircraft doing a run-up on the ground and have 2 pistons come right out through the side of the engine. Only 202 Manchesters were ever built, with production stopping a year after they entered service. Despite being grounded on 2 separate occasions for engine improvements, 64% of all operational Manchesters had already been lost before it was finally withdrawn from service in mid-1942. This left the RAF with two heavy bombers, the short Sterling and Handley-Page Halifax. I'm not going to talk much about the Sterling in this video, as I feel it wouldn't be fair to compare the three aircraft like for like. Its low service ceiling and very short range meant it just wasn't an effective strategic bomber, but maybe that's a topic for another video. Anyhow, the Halifax was having its own share of issues following its first operations in March 1941. There were a lot of small problems, but two big ones. Firstly, the aircraft was underpowered. During the redesign to 4 engines, the Halifax got bigger, heavier, and produced more drag, and even 4 Merlin 10 engines struggled to get the aircraft up to its mediocre service ceiling of 18,000 feet on a good day. The second issue were the twin rudders, which were prone to something called overbalancing. When overbalanced, aerodynamic forces would increase any applied deflection rather than restoring it to the centre. This led to the rudders locking into the fully deflected position, leaving the aircraft uncontrollable. This effect was especially common at lower speeds, making takeoffs and landings an incredibly dangerous affair. In an attempt to remedy these issues, the Halifax Mk II entered service in October 1941, equipped with a more powerful Merlin 20. However, this variant also had a large 4-gun dorsal turret, extra equipment, more paint, and an adjusted bomb bay, all of which increased weight and drag to the extent that the Mk II was barely an improvement at all. But the RAF didn't have anything better in 1941, so production continued while Handley-Page worked to remedy things. Meanwhile, Avro had been working behind the scenes on the Manchester Mk III, redesigned with 4 Merlin 20 engines of its own. This design was considered different enough for it to be redesignated as the Avro Lancaster. However, Avro were still working on the design, and interrupting Halifax production to switch to Lancasters was considered an insane risk at the time. Winston Churchill said in a letter to senior Air Ministry staff that any machine good enough to carry 2 tons to the Ruhr ought to have a long run in continuous production before it is discarded. As a result, even aging Whitleys and Blenheims remained in production, never mind the far newer and more capable Halifax. The Avro Lancaster, following more tweaks and fixes, eventually entered service in early 1942 and showed significant performance improvement over the Halifax. It was faster, had longer range, had a higher service ceiling, and could carry more bombs. It could also, importantly, carry larger bombs in its single vast bomb bay, whereas the Halifax's split bomb bay limited its options. The superiority was not just on paper either. This report outlines the missing rates of various bomber aircraft and reflects poorly on the Halifax, to say the least. It first lists how often each bomber type is intercepted by an enemy night fighter, then how often bombers are attacked by night fighters, then the percentage of intercepts that develop into an attack. An absolutely staggering rate for the Halifax. Simply put, if a Halifax and Lancaster are both successfully intercepted, the Halifax is more than 4 times more likely to be attacked. This leads to a shocking loss rate per sortie of 6.1% for the Halifax, far more than the other RAF bombers and nearly double that of the Lancaster. The explanation here is that while the Lancaster and Halifax both used the same engines, their position relative to the wing was different, with the Halifax's engines placed much higher up. What this meant was that the exhaust flames from the Halifax were much easier to see in the dark skies above Europe, especially from behind or above. Additionally, when Handley-Page tried to add exhaust shrouds or covers to fix this, the shrouds massively disrupted the airflow over the wing behind them, adding yet more drag. On the Lancaster, the exhaust was significantly lower, so the shrouds didn't have such an effect. As a result, German night fighters were far more likely to physically see the Halifax in the dark and then attack it. When they did so, the Halifax pilot would likely try to make evasive maneuvers, then, tragically, the rudders would overbalance and the Halifax would spiral downwards, a complete loss. This engine placement is part of the reason why these two seemingly identical aircraft with identical power plants had such massive differences in performance. The placement of the Merlins higher and closer to the wing's leading edge on the Halifax led to all sorts of nasty aerodynamic effects, extra vibration, and reduction gear issues. Anyway, these statistics were not painting a pretty picture, and soon the head of Bomber Command, Arthur Harris, was voicing his doubts about the ability of the Halifax to continue fighting with such nasty loss rates. He and Lord Cherwell noted that the Halifax only dropped 0.95 pounds of bombs per man-hour of manufacture compared to the Sterling's 1.2 and the Lancaster's 3.6, a more expensive bomber, dropping less bombs and getting shot down more. Naturally, questions were soon asked if all Halifax production could convert completely to the Lancaster, but it wasn't so simple. The scales, jigs and machinery required to produce the two bombers were just different. so even if you attempted to convert all Halifax factories and workers to Lancaster production, you'd have less bombers total. Still, Harris was unrelenting in his attacks on the Halifax and on Handley-Page, both the company and its founder, Frederick Handley-Page, who he thought was dragging his heels in fixing the Halifax's problems. He sent many incredibly irate letters to government officials to this extent, but here are some extracts from just one of them. Handley-Page was always weeping crocodile tears in my house and office, smarming his unconvincing assurances all over me. Nothing whatever ponderable is being done to make his deplorable product worthy for war or fit to meet those jeopardies that confront our gallant crews. Nothing will be done until Handley-Page and his gang are kicked out, lock, stock and barrel. We cannot do this by polite negotiation with these crooks and incompetents. In Russia it would long ago have been arranged with a gun, and to that extent I am a fervid communist. Despite Harris's clear venom at the mere thought of a Halifax bomber, development continued on both aircraft throughout 1942, producing the Lancaster Mk II and the Halifax Mk III, both using the Bristol Hercules radial power plant. The thinking behind this was that if Fighter Command were using Merlin engines in their Spitfires and Hurricanes, while Bomber Command were using them in Lancasters, Halifax, Mosquitoes, etc., then German air attacks on Rolls-Royce could essentially cripple the entire RAF. The issue was, as Avro and Harris soon discovered, was that the Hercules-powered Lancaster II was not very good, with similar performance to the Halifax II, if not worse. However, somewhat ironically considering the Air Ministry's insistence on Handley-Page using the Merlin in the first place, the Hercules-powered Halifax Mk III was a massive improvement on the Mk II, allowing the Halifax to fly 6,000 feet higher and 15 miles an hour faster, and putting it in the same rough performance ballpark as the Lancaster Mk I. The Halifax III also had a whole host of other improvements, many of which had already been adapted to the Mk II. The big changes were, of course, the engines, but the elimination of the nose turret and the adoption of a perspex nose massively decreased weight and drag. Additionally, the rudders were redesigned, opting for a larger rectangular shape instead of the smaller, poorly balanced, kidney-shaped originals. Soon the decision was made to ditch the Lancaster II and build as many Halifax IIIs as possible with the new Hercules radials, thus giving you redundancy and allowing Bomber Command to operate the two best variants of each type. Halifax III entered service in November 1943, but it took a while for its improvement to show itself, especially as Bomber Command went on increasingly dangerous missions into Germany. As a result, Harris and other key members of Parliament and the Air Ministry continued to push for an all-Lancaster production, especially as Merlin-powered Halifaxes were completely withdrawn from bomber operations following a frankly tragic loss rate of 13.3% over Leipzig in February. However, Harris and his gang did not succeed. The Halifax would serve until the end of the war, largely thanks to the heavy bomber needs of Operation Overlord, the towing of gliders, and relatively low-level, short-range attacks against the French coastline, where the Allies had air superiority. These are perfect missions for the Halifax and allowed the Lancasters to be used for the strategic bombing of Germany. It's fair to say that as a long-range strategic bomber, the Halifax was far inferior to the Lancaster, even if you're only comparing the radial-powered models of the late war. Statistics, especially wartime statistics, are always a bit murky, but numbers like this are pretty definitive. However, I do have a few words in defence of the Halifax. 1. For every Halifax shot down, there was a Lancaster that wasn't. With a finite number of enemy flak guns and night fighters in the air, the Halifax's lower ceiling and more visible exhausts likely drew fire away from the Lancasters they flew with, indirectly lowering the loss rate of the Lancaster. Switching to an all-Lancaster formation would have seen Lancaster losses rise as a result, even if the overall loss rate would have likely been lower. Important to remember when looking at statistics in isolation. 2. The Halifax was more rugged. Reports suggest that the hydraulic turrets on the Lancaster were 5 times more likely to be put out of action than the electro-hydraulic turrets of the Halifax. The Hercules engines were more reliable and better protected than the Merlins, and the single large bomb bay of the Lancaster made the central fuselage weaker than that of the Halifax. 3. The Halifax was more survivable. One 1944 report suggested that the survival rate for Lancaster crews shot down over Germany was only 11%, while the Halifax was almost 3 times that, at 29%. This is due to a few factors, namely the better positioned escape hatches, the larger escape hatches, and the roomier interior of the Halifax compared to the rather cramped Lancaster. When you're spiralling towards the ground in a flaming aircraft, these seemingly minor factors are incredibly important. And 4. The Halifax's roomier fuselage made it better for other operations, like mine laying, troop transport, power drops, and carrying cargo, including passengers post-war. Was it the Lancaster? No. Was it still a decent aircraft that did a job? Yes. The Hurricane wasn't a bad fighter just because the Spitfire was a better one. Sometimes one aircraft just gets better publicity, and my goal today was to do the Halifax some justice in that department. Thanks for watching the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think in the comments. Any corrections or suggestions always welcome. If you enjoyed, do leave a like and subscribe for more content like this. I'd recommend watching the similar video I did on the B-17 and B-24 earlier this year. If you'd like to support the channel further like these lovely people, the link to my Patreon is in the description below. If not, I'll see you next time.